On the same day, just 16 minutes apart, two different transfers took place. One was the rejection of 9-year-old Davian's treatment funding. The other was the transfer of $2.7 million to Trump's campaign. When Jasmine Crockett exposed this double transfer, the Trump family collapsed live on television. The fluorescent lights in hospital room 712 hummed like dying insects, casting a pale, stuttering glow across the face of 9-year-old Davian Marsh. He hadn't spoken in 36 hours. Medical tubes wrapped around his small chest like mechanical vines, beeping in steady rhythms that marked time between hope and inevitability. Outside the glass partition that separated his room from the hallway, his mother, Deborah, stood clutching a stack of unpaid medical bills, her voice steady but strained as she spoke to the young woman behind the billing counter. "I submitted the paperwork 3 times, Deborah said, her words carrying the weight of a mother watching her child slip away. "The doctor said your foundation had already signed off on the funding. The Trump Children's Fund was supposed to cover his treatment." The billing clerk, whose name tag read Jennifer, avoided eye contact as she tapped mechanically at her computer keyboard, each keystroke sounding like nails on a coffin. "Ma'am, I understand your frustration, but the request for financial assistance was reviewed by our partners at the Trump Children's Fund and unfortunately denied. The case was determined to be," she paused, consulting her screen, "not eligible for priority funding." The words hit Deborah like a physical blow. Not eligible? "My son is dying. He's 9 years old. How is a dying child not eligible for help from a children's charity?" Jennifer's response was delivered in the flat robotic tone of someone who had been trained to deflect rather than engage. The foundation prioritizes cases with broader social visibility, situations that can help raise awareness for their broader mission. They focus on terminal patients whose stories can generate media attention and donations. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that wraps around your throat and squeezes. Deborah stepped backward as if she had been shoved, her hands beginning to shake as she processed what she had just been told. Her son wasn't dying visibly enough. He wasn't photogenic enough for a charity that existed to help children exactly like him. "He's not visible enough?" Deborah whispered, pulling out her phone to show a photo of Davian smiling with a stuffed dinosaur, his cheeks still chubby despite months of chemotherapy, his eyes still radiant with the kind of hope that only children possess. "This isn't visible enough for you." Security was called when Deborah refused to leave the counter, but by the time the guards arrived, she had already collapsed into a plastic chair in the waiting area, silent and defeated, clutching her son's insurance rejection letter like a death warrant. Back in room 712, Davian's chest rose and fell with increasing difficulty. The machines that had been keeping rhythm with his heartbeat began to slow, their electronic pulses growing more sporadic and uncertain. At 10:41 p.m., a nurse arrived with a clipboard and a small plastic bag containing his personal belongings, his medication history, a single Lego figurine, and a red wristband stamped with gold foil lettering that read, "Thank you for believing in me. Trump Children's Fund." Deborah didn't scream when she saw the wristband. She just stared at it with the kind of hollow recognition that comes when betrayal finally shows its true face. Then she pulled the wristband from the bag as if it might still be warm, as if it might still carry some trace of her son's pulse, and slipped it onto her own wrist. She sat down beside Davian's bed and folded his small fingers into hers. At 2:06 a.m. on November 14th, Davian Marsh took his last breath. The machines didn't beep dramatically like they do in movies. They just sighed, their electronic voices fading to silence as if even they understood the futility of what had just occurred. No doctor came in to offer explanations or condolences. No representative from the Trump Children's Fund called to express sympathy. But at exactly 8:13 the next morning, Deborah received an automated email in her inbox reminding her to complete a donor satisfaction survey about her experience with the foundation's services. What Deborah didn't know, what nobody knew at that moment, was that at 7:52 p.m. the previous evening, exactly 16 minutes after her son's funding had been officially denied, A wire transfer of $2.7 million had been processed from the Eric Trump Foundation to Victory 24 PAC, one of Donald Trump's primary campaign funding organizations. The transfer had been authorized with Eric Trump's electronic signature and processed through the same financial system that had rejected Davian's medical expenses just minutes earlier. While a 9-year-old boy was dying in a hospital bed because the Trump Children's Fund claimed they didn't have money to save him, millions of dollars from the same network of Trump charitable organizations were flowing directly into political campaign accounts. This devastating timeline would remain hidden for months, buried in the labyrinth of shell companies and subsidiary organizations that the Trump family used to obscure the flow of money between their charitable foundations and their political operations. It might have stayed hidden forever, if not for an anonymous email that arrived in Jasmine Crockett's congressional office on a cold Tuesday morning in March. Jasmine had been catching up on constituent correspondence, working through the usual mix of budget complaints, infrastructure requests, and local political concerns that filled a congresswoman's typical day. Most of the emails were routine, predictable matters that her staff could handle with form responses and scheduled follow-ups. But one message caught her attention immediately. The subject line was blank. There was no greeting, no signature, no identification of the sender, just one chilling sentence. You should see where the money really went. Attached to the message were 2 files. The first was a PDF of a wire transfer receipt, clean, official, and undeniably authentic. It showed $2.7 million being moved from the Eric Trump Foundation to Victory 24 PAC on November 14th at 7:52 p.m. The second attachment made Jasmine's blood run cold. It was a photograph, slightly grainy but unmistakably clear, showing a small funeral program. Davian Marsh's name and photograph were printed on the cover, along with the dates of his brief life. And resting on top of the program, like an accusation made manifest, was a red wristband bearing the Trump Children's Fund logo. Jasmine stared at her computer screen for several minutes, her mind working to process the implications of what she was looking at. This wasn't just about political corruption or campaign finance violations. This was about a dead child. This was about blood money disguised as charity and marketed as compassion. She didn't hesitate. She picked up her secure phone and dialed a number she hadn't used in over a year. Arthur Glenn, a former financial oversight auditor who had walked away from a 30-year career in government financial analysis after becoming disgusted with the level of corruption he was forced to ignore. Arthur answered on the second ring. "I was wondering how long it would take before someone connected those dots," he said before Jasmine had even identified herself. "You've been tracking this?" Jasmine asked. "I've been watching the Trump family's charitable operations since 2020, Arthur replied. "The red wristband case is just the tip of the iceberg. They've been laundering campaign money through children's charities for years because nobody wants to be the person who investigates a dying kid's medical bills. It's the perfect cover." Arthur explained how the system worked. The Trump organization would set up shell charities that would accept donations from wealthy contributors who wanted tax deductions for their political giving. These charities would then deny funding to actual sick children while secretly transferring the money to political action committees through a complex web of subsidiary organizations and shell companies. The most recent transfer to Victory 24 PAC wasn't unusual except for its timing. The fact that it had been processed within minutes of denying medical funding to a dying child made it not just morally reprehensible, but potentially illegal under several federal statutes governing charitable fraud and campaign finance violations. Davian Marsh wasn't the first, Arthur told Jasmine. He was just the sloppiest. They usually space these things out better, but somebody got greedy or careless. The paper trail is so obvious that even a first-year law student could follow it. Jasmine spent the rest of that day gathering additional documentation. Arthur connected her with other financial analysts who had been tracking similar patterns. By evening, she had assembled a comprehensive picture of what appeared to be a systematic scheme to defraud charitable donors while simultaneously violating campaign finance laws. But more importantly, She had the story of Davian Marsh, a 9-year-old boy who had died because a fake charity had prioritized political fundraising over saving children's lives. That night, Jasmine sat in her apartment looking at a printed copy of Davian's obituary and a replica red wristband she had ordered that afternoon. The wristband felt heavier than it should have, as if it were made of something more substantial than rubber and cheap metal. It felt like grief transformed into evidence. She traced the gold lettering with her thumb. "Thank you for believing in me," and whispered a promise that nobody else was in the room to hear. "They're going to pay for what they did to you." The next morning, Jasmine walked into the office of Representative Gail Simmons, chair of the House Oversight Committee, without an appointment. Gail was reviewing the morning's political headlines when Jasmine dropped a manila envelope onto her desk. "I need a hearing," Jasmine said without preamble. "I have a dead child, a fraudulent charity, a $2.7 million wire transfer, and Eric Trump's signature authorizing the blood money to be sent to his father's campaign." Gail opened the envelope and spent several minutes reviewing the contents in silence. When she finally looked up, her expression was grim. "You understand what you're asking for," she said quietly. "You're not just accusing individuals of corruption, you're taking on an entire family dynasty, and they have resources most people can't imagine." "Then I'm going to need the biggest microphone you can give me," Jasmine replied. 3 hours later, the House Oversight Committee voted unanimously to schedule an emergency hearing on the financial practices of Trump family charitable organizations. The hearing would be broadcast live on national television, and both Donald Trump and Eric Trump would be subpoenaed to testify under oath. The news spread through Capitol Hill like wildfire. Some congressional staffers whispered that Jasmine had committed political suicide by targeting such a powerful family. Others watched her in the hallways with a mixture of admiration and concern, understanding that she had painted a target on her back that would attract enemies she might not be prepared to face. But Jasmine had spent years as a defense attorney before entering politics. She understood that the most dangerous opponents were often the ones who believed their power made them untouchable. And she had learned long ago that the best way to defeat an enemy who thought they were invincible was to expose their vulnerabilities in the most public form possible. The hearing was scheduled for March 22nd in Congressional Room 236. The topic was listed in the official record as financial irregularities in Trump family charitable organizations. But everyone who mattered understood what it was really about. A 9-year-old boy who had died while his potential salvation was transferred to a political campaign account. When the day of the hearing arrived, room 236 was packed beyond capacity. Journalists sat shoulder to shoulder in the press gallery. Congressional staff members lined the walls. Television cameras were positioned to capture every angle of what everyone expected to be, either a historic moment of accountability or a spectacular political implosion. Donald Trump entered the hearing room wearing his signature blue tie and the kind of practiced scowl that had served him well in countless other congressional appearances. Eric Trump followed close behind, his arms folded across his chest with the kind of defensive posture that suggested he believed he had already won whatever battle was about to be fought. Both men carried themselves with the unmistakable arrogance that comes from a lifetime of inherited power and unearned privilege. They had survived congressional hearings before. They had weathered political storms that would have destroyed lesser figures. They were confident that whatever Jasmine Crockett thought she had discovered, it wouldn't be enough to damage them seriously. They were about to learn how wrong they were. Jasmine walked into the hearing room with measured steps and calm focus, wearing a simple black blazer that suggested both professionalism and mourning. In her right hand, she carried a plain manila folder. In her left hand, she held something much smaller, barely visible until she reached the witness table. She didn't speak immediately. She didn't grandstand or make opening statements designed for television sound bites. Instead, with the kind of deliberate grace that only comes from absolute certainty about the righteousness of one's cause, she placed a red rubber wristband in the center of the witness table. The wristband landed silently, but its impact was immediate and electric. Every camera in the room zoomed in on it. Reporters raised their pens. Congressional staff members exchanged meaningful glances. Donald Trump leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he tried to process what he was seeing. Eric Trump remained motionless, but something in his expression suggested he understood exactly what that wristband represented. Jasmine looked past both men, directing her attention to the millions of Americans she knew were watching from hospital waiting rooms, office break rooms, and living rooms across the country. She adjusted her microphone slowly and spoke her first words of the hearing. This wristband belonged to Davian Marsh. He was 9 years old when he died at St. Lillian's Children's Hospital on November 14th. The cause of death listed on his certificate was acute lymphoblastic leukemia. But that's not what killed him. She paused just long enough for the silence to settle over the room like a blanket. What killed Davian Marsh was a denial email from the Trump Children's Fund stating that his case was not a priority for funding. That email was sent at 7:36 p.m. 16 minutes later, at 7:52 p.m. on the same day, a wire transfer was processed, sending $2.7 million from the Eric Trump Foundation to Victory 24 PAC, one of Donald Trump's primary campaign funding organizations. Jasmine reached into her folder and pulled out a copy of the wire transfer receipt, laying it flat beside the red wristband. The large screen behind her flickered to life, displaying a magnified version of the document that showed bank routing numbers, transaction identification codes, and Eric Trump's electronic signature clearly visible at the bottom. "This is not a theory," Jasmine continued, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "This is not speculation or partisan accusation. This is a documented transaction, a child's life exchanged for a political contribution, a campaign check written with blood money." A murmur of shock rippled through the gallery, but Jasmine wasn't finished. She reached for her microphone and leaned closer, her voice dropping to the kind of intimate tone that made every person watching feel like she was speaking directly to them. "Let me be absolutely clear about what we're discussing here. This is not about politics. This is not about policy disagreements or partisan warfare. This is about a 9-year-old boy who wore this wristband because he believed the people who gave it to him actually cared about saving his life." She looked directly at Eric Trump for the first time since entering the room. "And you let him die so you could fund your father's campaign." The accusation landed in the hearing room like a physical blow. Congressional staff members froze mid-note. Reporters stopped typing. Even the photographers seemed to hesitate before clicking their cameras, as if they understood they were witnessing something more significant than typical political theater. Eric Trump's carefully composed expression cracked for just a moment, revealing something that might have been guilt or fear or simple recognition that he was in more trouble than he had anticipated. He turned toward his attorney and whispered something urgent, but his lawyer could only shake his head helplessly. Donald Trump remained stone-faced, his arms crossed defensively across his chest, but his refusal to make eye contact with either Jasmine or the cameras spoke louder than any statement he could have issued. Jasmine wasn't finished. She pressed a button on the control panel in front of her, and the screen behind her split to show two documents side by side. The wire transfer authorization, timestamped at 7:52 p.m., and Davian's funding denial timestamped at 7:36 p.m. 16 minutes, she said, allowing the words to hang in the air. 16 minutes between denying medical care to a dying child and authorizing the transfer of millions of dollars to a political campaign. Same day, same financial system, same signature authorizing both transactions. Eric Trump shifted uncomfortably in his chair and finally spoke for the first time since the hearing began. "Congresswoman, this is political theater. You're staging a spectacle based on coincidental timing and emotional manipulation." Jasmine's response was delivered with the kind of cold precision that had made her legendary in Texas courtrooms. "Mr. Trump, this is what happens when politics kills children." The sentence hit the hearing room like a sledgehammer. There was no applause, no dramatic gasps, just the soft hum of live television cameras and the occasional click of a pen as reporters struggled to capture the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Jasmine moved closer to the screen, her hand hovering over the image of the wire transfer. "This money," she said, was supposed to save lives. It didn't. It was supposed to help children like Davian Marsh survive diseases that are completely treatable with proper funding and medical care. Instead, it was used to buy television advertisements and campaign rallies. She turned back to face Eric Trump directly. I want to know who made the decision that Davian Marsh wasn't worth saving. I want to know who decided that your father's political ambitions were more important than a 9-year-old boy's life. Eric glanced desperately at his attorney, but the man remained silent, apparently understanding that any response would only make the situation worse. Donald Trump maintained his stony expression, but his jaw was clenched tight enough to suggest he was grinding his teeth. Jasmine continued her methodical destruction of their carefully constructed defense. We throw words like overhead and administrative costs around as if they're meaningless accounting terms. But this wasn't overhead. This was a choice. A conscious decision to prioritize political fundraising over saving the life of a child who trusted you to help him. The screen behind her changed again, this time showing a photograph of Davian Marsh smiling in his hospital bed, the red wristband visible on his thin wrist. The image was devastating in its innocence, a sick child who still believed that adults would do the right thing if given the chance. Ask yourselves, Jasmine said to the committee and to the millions of Americans watching at home, if this had been your son, your daughter, lying in that hospital bed, what would you have done when the funding was pulled? Would you have signed that check authorizing millions of dollars to go to political advertisements instead of medical treatment? No one answered. No one moved. Eric Trump cleared his throat as if preparing to speak, but no words came out. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds, an eternity in television time, before it was broken by a sound that no microphone had been prepared to capture. It was a sharp, sudden intake of breath, like someone who had been holding their breath for too long and finally lost the ability to control it. The sound came from the back of the hearing room, where Deborah Marsh sat dressed in black, clutching a framed photograph of her son against her chest. Her shoulders were shaking, her lips pressed tightly together, but her eyes remained focused on the red wristband lying in the center of the witness table. She wasn't sobbing dramatically like bereaved mothers in movies. Her grief was quieter than that, sadder, more honest. It sounded like heartbreak trying to remain polite in the presence of the people who had caused it. The sound made Eric Trump blink once, but he didn't turn to look at her, as if acknowledging her presence would make his culpability real in a way he wasn't prepared to face. Jasmine heard the sound and understood immediately what it meant. She didn't flinch or pause in her presentation. Instead, she adjusted her microphone with the same calm composure she had maintained throughout the hearing and said what no one else in the room had the courage to voice. This child wasn't collateral damage. He was the receipt. The words dropped into the hearing room like glass shattering in a cathedral. One congressional aide gasped audibly. A staffer in the far corner dropped his pen. Even Republican committee members who had remained stoic and defensive throughout the hearing suddenly found themselves unable to meet anyone's eyes. Outside the hearing room, the impact was immediate and seismic. Capitol Hill reporters began broadcasting live updates with no editing or commentary needed. The raw footage was devastating enough on its own. Cable news networks switched their programming mid-broadcast to provide continuous coverage of what was rapidly becoming the most explosive congressional hearing in recent memory. Social media platforms crashed under the volume of posts and shares as videos of Jasmine's presentation spread faster than their servers could process them. The hashtag red wristband began trending nationally within minutes, surpassing celebrity gossip, sports scores, and even breaking news from overseas. By the time Jasmine leaned back in her chair, 38 million Americans were watching the hearing live across all platforms and networks. Some were watching from hospital waiting rooms where they were facing their own medical crises. Others watched from office break rooms during lunch breaks. Many watched from living rooms where folded American flags hung in display cases above fireplaces, quiet reminders of families who had lost loved ones in service to a country they believed would protect the vulnerable. In the hearing room, Donald Trump remained silent, his practiced political instincts apparently failing him for the first time in recent memory. Eric Trump sat frozen in place, his earlier confidence completely evaporated. Their legal team whispered urgently among themselves, but no one seemed prepared to offer a defense for the indefensible. And in that profound stillness, Deborah Marsh stood up from her seat in the gallery. She didn't shout or make demands. She simply stepped forward, still clutching her son's photograph, her movements careful and deliberate. A security guard instinctively moved to intercept her, but Jasmine lifted her hand in a subtle gesture that somehow conveyed authority without aggression. The room seemed to collectively understand that this moment belonged to Deborah, and that interrupting it would be an act of unconscionable cruelty. Deborah's voice, when she finally spoke, cracked like old wood under pressure, but her words were clear enough for every microphone in the room to capture. His name was Davian. He wanted to be a doctor when he grew up. He thought that wristband meant someone actually cared about whether he lived or died. She took one step closer to the witness table, her fingers white from gripping the photograph too tightly. Then she looked directly at Eric Trump and whispered 4 words that would be replayed on news programs for months afterward. "You let him die." Eric Trump didn't look up. He didn't respond. He didn't even acknowledge that she had spoken. His silence in the face of a grieving mother's accusation was more damaging than any admission of guilt could have been. The gallery behind Deborah was completely silent. No phones buzzed, no papers rustled. There was only the sound of cameras recording history and hearts breaking in real time. Jasmine stood and walked slowly toward Deborah, gently taking the photograph from her trembling hands. She set it beside the red wristband on the witness table, creating a small memorial that somehow managed to contain more moral authority than all the legal documents and financial records combined. "This," Jasmine said quietly, gesturing toward the photograph and the wristband, "isn't just about Davian Marsh. This is about every mother who called a medical assistance hotline and got put on hold for hours. This is about every hospital that was told funding wasn't available while millions of dollars were being transferred to buy political advertisements. This is about a system that treats children's lives as line items in a budget rather than as human beings deserving of protection and care." She turned toward the cameras, knowing that her words were being heard by millions of Americans who were grappling with their own medical crises and financial struggles. "We are not here for headlines or political theater. We are here because a 9-year-old boy died while wearing a wristband that promised him hope, and the people who gave him that wristband chose to fund a political campaign instead of saving his life." For the next several minutes, Jasmine methodically walked the committee through additional evidence that Arthur Glenn and other financial investigators had compiled. She showed them patterns of similar transfers, documented cases of other sick children who had been denied funding, and a comprehensive analysis of how the Trump charitable network had been systematically defrauding both donors and beneficiaries for years. But the technical details of campaign finance violations and charitable fraud seemed almost secondary to the image of Davian's photograph sitting beside his red wristband on the witness table. That simple memorial had transformed what might have been a routine congressional oversight hearing into something approaching a national reckoning with the consequences of corruption. When Jasmine finally concluded her presentation, the hearing room remained silent for nearly a full minute. Chairman Simmons seemed reluctant to break the spell that had been cast over the proceedings, understanding instinctively that anything she said would seem inadequate compared to what had just transpired. Donald Trump left the hearing without making any statement to reporters. Eric Trump followed close behind, his head down and his earlier arrogance completely deflated. Their legal team rushed to catch up with them, apparently as eager as their clients to escape the scene of what had become a complete political and moral catastrophe. Within hours, the Department of Justice announced that it was opening a criminal investigation into the financial practices of Trump family charitable organizations. The Internal Revenue Service revoked the tax-exempt status of the Trump Children's Fund and 2 related organizations. Several major donors to Trump political causes issued public statements distancing themselves from any involvement in charitable fraud. But perhaps most importantly, Davian Marsh's story had been told to the largest audience possible, ensuring that his death would not be forgotten or dismissed as an unfortunate coincidence. The red wristband that had once symbolized false hope had been transformed into a symbol of accountability and justice. That evening, Jasmine stood on the steps of the Capitol as the sun set over Washington. The city lights were beginning to twinkle in the growing darkness, and she could see tourists and government workers making their way home after another day in the nation's capital. Most of them had probably watched at least part of the hearing, and many of them were likely thinking about their own children and grandchildren. A reporter approached and asked if she wanted to make a statement about the day's events. Jasmine shook her head and simply said, "Davian Marsh's mother said everything that needed to be said today. The rest is up to the justice system." But as she walked toward her car, she touched the red wristband she now wore on her own wrist, a replica of the one Davian had worn in his final days. She had promised his memory that the people responsible for his death would be held accountable, and she intended to spend whatever political capital was necessary to ensure that promise was kept. The woman who had walked into that hearing room with a manila folder and a child's wristband had reminded an entire nation that behind every policy decision and budget allocation were real human lives hanging in the balance. She had proven that sometimes the most powerful weapon against corruption isn't complex legal arguments or political maneuvering. It's simply telling the truth about what happens when power chooses profits over people. And she had shown that in America, when someone has the courage to speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves, even the most powerful families can be held accountable for their actions. What do you think about this moment that changed everything? When a simple red wristband exposed millions in blood money and brought down a political dynasty? Did it restore your faith in justice or reveal how broken our system really is? Subscribe to Scale of Justice for more stories where truth defeats power, and hit that notification bell so you never miss the moments when courage confronts corruption. Because sometimes the smallest victims demand the biggest accountability, and heroes like Jasmine Crockett make sure their voices are finally heard. 1,200-word story extension, The Network of Deception. But the story didn't end with the Trump family's public humiliation and criminal investigation. What happened in the days following the hearing would reveal that Davian Marsh was just one victim in a web of corruption so vast and sophisticated that it stretched across multiple states and involved dozens of fake charities, all designed to funnel money away from dying children and into political war chests. 3 days after the hearing, Jasmine received a secure message through an encrypted communication app she had installed for sensitive congressional business. The sender identified himself only as a former believer, but the information he provided would crack open an investigation that made the Trump Children's Fund scandal look like a small-scale operation. "Congresswoman Crockett," the message began, "what you exposed in that hearing was just the tip of the iceberg. There are 47 other children whose medical funding was denied by Trump-affiliated charities in the past 18 months, and every single denial was followed by major transfers to political organizations. I have the documentation to prove it, but I need protection before I come forward." The message included a partial list of names that made Jasmine's blood run cold. Emma Rodriguez, age 7, brain tumor, denied funding 3 days before $1.8 million was transferred to American Patriots PAC. Marcus Williams, age 12, heart surgery, denied funding 2 hours before $3.2 million went to Victory Fund America. Sarah Chen, age 5, rare genetic disorder, denied funding on the same day. $4.1 million was moved to Trump Victory Committee. Each name represented not just a sick child, but a family that had been betrayed by an organization they trusted to save their loved one's life. Each denial had been followed by massive transfers to political organizations, suggesting a systematic scheme to prioritize campaign fundraising over the very mission these charities claimed to serve. The whistleblower, who eventually identified himself as Dr. Marcus Webb, had been the medical director for the Trump Children's Fund's Application Review Board. He had joined the organization believing he would be helping to save children's lives, but had gradually realized that the charity existed primarily as a money laundering operation disguised as humanitarian work. They had algorithms, Dr. Webb explained during a secure video conference with Jasmine's investigation team, sophisticated software that would analyze media coverage, social media engagement, and fundraising potential for each child's case. Kids who could generate publicity and donations would get approved. Kids who couldn't be used for marketing purposes would get denied, regardless of how treatable their conditions were. Dr. Webb revealed that the organization had been using artificial intelligence to scan social media profiles, news coverage, and even school records to determine which sick children would make the most compelling poster children for their fundraising campaigns. Children from photogenic families with social media presence and compelling backstories would receive funding and extensive media coverage. Children from poor families, immigrant families, or families without social media sophistication would be quietly denied and forgotten. Davian Marsh was denied funding because his mother wasn't active on social media, Dr. Webb explained. The algorithm determined that his case wouldn't generate enough publicity to justify the expense. They literally had a cost-benefit analysis that calculated whether a child's life was worth saving based on their marketing potential. But the most disturbing revelation was yet to come. Dr. Webb had discovered that the network of fake charities extended far beyond the Trump organization. Similar schemes were being operated by political figures across the country, all using the same basic model. Create charities that claim to help vulnerable populations, use those charities to attract tax-deductible donations from wealthy individuals, then transfer the money to political organizations while providing minimal actual assistance to the people they claim to serve. This isn't just about the Trump family, Dr. Webb warned. This is about an entire shadow economy built on exploiting people's compassion and literally profiting from children's deaths. Every time a child dies because they were denied funding, the charity can use that death in their next fundraising campaign to generate even more donations. Working with Dr. Webb's intelligence, Jasmine's investigation team began mapping the full scope of what they started calling the charity industrial complex. What they discovered was a sophisticated network of interconnected organizations that existed primarily to funnel money between wealthy donors and political campaigns while maintaining the facade of charitable work. The network included organizations with names designed to sound compassionate and trustworthy: American Children's Medical Foundation, Patriots for Kids Healthcare, Freedom Medical Assistance Fund, and dozens of others. All of them used similar marketing strategies, employing professional photographers to create compelling images of sick children, hiring social media specialists to maximize engagement, and using data analytics to target potential donors with emotionally manipulative advertising campaigns. But when investigators examined the actual medical assistance provided by these organizations, they found a pattern of systematic denial and deception. Children who could be used for marketing purposes would receive limited funding along with extensive media coverage. Children who couldn't generate publicity would be quietly denied, and their cases would never be mentioned in the organization's promotional materials. They were literally farming sick children for content, Jasmine told her chief of staff during one late-night strategy session. Taking pictures of kids they had no intention of helping, using those pictures to raise millions of dollars, then denying medical care to the same kids they featured in their advertising. The investigation also revealed that the network had been using sophisticated psychological research to maximize the emotional impact of their fundraising campaigns. They had hired marketing firms that specialized in what they called empathy monetization, the science of converting human compassion into political donations. These firms had conducted focus groups to determine which types of children's stories generated the most donor response, which medical conditions created the strongest emotional reactions, and which family situations produced the highest conversion rates from advertising exposure to actual donations. They had literally turned children's suffering into a data-driven marketing strategy. But most importantly, they had given names and faces to the victims of this systematic cruelty. Davian Marsh was no longer just one dead child. He was the symbol of a generation of children who had been betrayed by a system that claimed to exist for their protection, but actually existed to exploit their suffering for political gain. The red wristband that had started as a symbol of false hope had become a rallying cry for comprehensive reform of the entire charitable sector, and Jasmine Crockett had become the leading voice, demanding that America finally hold accountable the people who had been literally profiting from children's deaths. The network that thought they were untouchable was about to learn that some fights are worth the consequences, and some truths are too important to stay buried.